So that's it for me this evening, folks. I'm going to pull down this poll question and hope you enjoy the panel.
Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Jeff Kinder. I'm the Executive Director for Science and Innovation here at the Institute on Governance, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this evening's Policy Crunch. It's actually the first in our season 3 of the Policy Crunch speaker series. It's hard to believe we're already in season 3. Before I go further, I would like to acknowledge that at least those of us in Ottawa are convening on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Before I throw it to Toby Fife, our president, who will be serving as tonight's moderator, I do just want to mention that this is a monthly series, and we're really excited about the topic or the overall theme of this series this year, disruption and convergence in public policy and governance. So we hope that you'll be able to join us each month for some exciting topics. Tonight is no exception. The topic could not be more relevant: governance through COVID, lessons from disruption. Just in terms of the format, Toby will introduce the speakers, and they'll each give some opening remarks, but then we will save as much time as we can for your questions and an opportunity for you to interact with the speakers. At 7, we'll draw that portion of the session to a close, and we will then put each of the speakers into a Zoom breakout room. So if you have additional questions that you'd like to ask, you can stick around between 7 and 7:30 and interact directly with the speakers. I believe that's all the logistics. So with that, I will turn it over to Toby Fife.
Well, thank you, Jeff. And I need to say welcome to everyone to the third season of Policy Crunch. And I will also echo what he said. I cannot imagine a more relevant topic over the next few months than disruption and convergence in public policy and governance. I mean, if you look what's happening south of the border, ask yourself, is there any other topic that we could be exploring over the next little while as the universe is unfolding. So congratulations to Rhonda, Jeff, and Becky, and the IOG team for putting this series together. But as Jeff said, tonight's topic, we're going to move back into Canada, actually, and look at governance through COVID-19 and lessons. We're calling it lessons from the disruption. And let me tell you a bit about how we got there. This summer, I was asked to contribute to an important initiative launched by Queen's University School of Policy Studies. And the idea was exactly to examine the impact of COVID-19 on how government has been behaving and the future of good government and good governance in Canada. Now, the cool thing about tonight is that the paper hasn't come out yet, so you're going to get a bit of a scoop, and we're going to unpack just a few of the learnings from the paper. But before I introduce the panel members and we get to it, let me turn it over to the lead of the project, Dr. Kathy Brock. She's a professor and senior fellow at the School of Policy Studies at Queen's. Kathy?
Thank you, Toby. The governance working group in the Queen's School of Policy Studies is really pleased to be engaging in this policy crunch with the Institute on Governance. When the first effects of the pandemic were being realized, Warren Mabey, the director of this school, created a series of working groups to examine the world as it was being reshaped by COVID-19. And reshaping has occurred in areas of health, economics, income, governance, all areas that the school is examining in a series of white papers that will be put on the web, as Toby indicated, in mid-October. The governance working group brought together 15 leading analysts, including your very own Toby Fife, to focus on key areas where COVID is transforming government and government operations. While the white paper is rich in ideas that cover a number of areas, we did focus on certain areas that we thought were very important. The collective insight of the GWG, the governance working group, was that while our leaders and institutions of government have served us well to date throughout the pandemic, especially when we compare it to other countries, we will need to adapt our institutions, and our leaders will need to adapt to a changed world if we're going to emerge from the crisis stronger and more resilient. So today, you're going to see the insights from 3 of the products in this working paper. Turn it over to you, Toby.
Well, thank you. And I'm going to allow me just to add a little more before we get right into it. I think one of the lessons that we got from the paper, all of us who contributed to it, was that how the government has managed the pandemic so far raises real questions that should matter to us. They relate to things like how decisions are made at the political level, the role and effectiveness of parliamentary oversight, the role of central agencies, and public service accountability. And what our study showed is that these issues may well have, how these issues were treated during the pandemic, may well have real implications for the government and good governance far beyond the pandemic. So as I said, you're going to get a flavor of what the paper is going to come out with in mid-October. And the 3 speakers that you're going to listen to here tonight contributed to it. The first is Kathy Brock, who of course you've just met. The second is Laurie Turnbull. She's the director of the School of Policy Studies at Dalhousie University. And our third is Andrew Graham. He's an adjunct faculty member of the School of Policy Studies at Queen's and a former assistant deputy minister with over 30 years in the Canadian Public Service. So I'm going to ask each of them just to make their introductory remarks, and then we will open it up to discussion and questions. You can send questions via Zoom. You can send them via this meeting, the Zoom function in the chat area. You can send them via YouTube and through our Slack workspace. So let me start by asking Kathy to take it over and launch the discussion. You'll need to turn on your microphone.
Thank you again, Toby. When we began work on the white paper, one of the burning issues for me was what has happened to our parliament. Throughout the crisis, our parliament has taken second seat to the executive. And this I found very worrisome as someone who has advised governments, who's advised premiers, and has advised cabinets, cabinet ministers, Indigenous leaders. This balance was not the right one that we want struck in a Westminster model of parliamentary government. And I was really struck in August when the Prime Minister appeared before the Finance Committee, and he started to explain that originally, when he brought forward proposals on he had received questions in Parliament, and he took that proposal to have the contract for students and volunteers back to the civil service for more deliberation. This was really important, and it was significant to me because it reminded me of how well Parliament did work during the crisis in raising important issues, whether it was whether or not benefits were reaching the right people or whether they went far enough. And the government did respond by reconsidering and extending benefits, or in the case of we looking at the contract and then deciding to go ahead. So this was very positive. But at the same time, Parliament was marginalized. The sittings were reduced. There were no confidence matters. Originally, the topics were limited that could be raised in the hybrid Parliament that was formed. And that meant that important issues went undiscovered throughout COVID. And they went unnoticed in some cases, even though the opposition tried to raise them. And this was in part because the Prime Minister took to giving media briefings outside of his residence at Rideau Hall, Rideau Cottage. And he's responded directly to the media, but the opposition wasn't there. And then the opposition had trouble getting media attention to raise questions that were of concern to Canadians. So I began to think about the marginalization of Parliament, particularly when the opposition agreed to give up opposition days and when they could submit written questions, but they gave up the right to have a response by a certain deadline, when they had an agreement that originally the government proposed to have no parliamentary scrutiny of its financial decisions until December 31st, 2021. The Conservatives did push and had that rolled back to the end of September 2020. And even when the government prorogued Parliament, it wasn't getting the scrutiny it needs. And Parliament is critical. It has two roles. One is to support the government, and we saw Parliament doing that role very well when it supported the emergency measures. But the second role is to hold the government accountable. And those measures that were taken in Parliament prevented Parliament from fully holding the government accountable. Lack of supervision of the spending. The fact we still don't have a budget when we could have had a budget and we could have had fiscal updates with scenarios that built in the conditions that explained that some measures were more hypothetical or speculative than real. The lack of scrutiny and attention that the opposition could give. Parliament truly became a shadow in the wings instead of being a full actor with the ability to exercise its full democratic functions. And this was particularly curious to me because there was an alternative model of how our Parliament could have functioned. This is laid out in the Emergencies Act, and the parties could have pulled on that model without the federal government invoking the emergencies legislation. In that act, there's a model of Parliament operating during an emergency like this. And it says the executive should be subject to scrutiny by Parliament and by the courts. Of course, the courts would be delayed, so they're not effective in the moment, as effective in the moment. Parliament was given 3 powers of review. First, to review any declaration of emergency, that wouldn't apply here. But secondly, to review any orders and actions a government takes during a crisis. And this is very powerful. It also has provisions to have a parliamentary committee struck that could look at matters in confidence if the government thought these matters should not be in the public mind. And third, perhaps most importantly, there's a provision in the Act that requires the government to strike an inquiry that would report within a year after the pandemic or an health emergency has occurred, and Parliament would then scrutinize the results of the inquiry and why the government took the actions it did. Out of that, we would get learning, and that would be beneficial to the public service, to the executive, to Parliament itself, and to Canadians. So the first paper and the second paper deal with these two elements. Coming out of the paper, we do make some recommendations, and that is we need a critical examination of what Parliament did and the decisions that were taken by the executive. We need to understand, and perhaps PROC could take this on, looking at all party agreements. When are they appropriate and when they should they not be allowed? Do we need some regulations that outline a model of Parliament that could operate in a crisis like this? A hybrid model, we now know how to do that. We now know how to do electronic voting. We could build those features in. And the Emergency Act. The triggers on it were faulty. It requires the consent of the provinces. It couldn't be triggered by the federal government during this crisis. Some people say it could never be triggered. Is it a faulty piece of legislation, and do we need to look at how to update it? Good governance is democratic governance, and I'm afraid we didn't quite get that during the pandemic. Thank you, Toby.
Thank you, Kathy. Great stuff to start off the conversation. Let me go to Laurie Turnbull, who's the director of the School of Policy Studies at Dalhousie University. Laurie.
Thank you so much, Toby. And thank you for inviting me. And also thank you to Kathy for all the work that she's done on this project. This was a several months long endeavor. And I'm really thankful that I got to be involved, because my full-time gig is Dalhousie, but I'm an adjunct at Queen's, which kind of gave me a little bit of a quasi-citizenship so that I was able to participate. So I'm very, very thankful for that. So I'll tell you a little bit about, I'll look at my time here to make sure I don't speak too long. I'm going to tell you a little bit what I did for the project, and just kind of give you a bit of a snapshot here. So it was my job to talk about the role of central agencies in managing the federal government's response to COVID. So we all know on this call that the central agencies, we're talking about the Privy Council Office, PCO, Treasury Board, and the Department of Finance. So they're distinct from line departments for that central coordinating function that they provide. And so obviously in this case, they provided that central role in coordinating the federal government's very quick and multifaceted response to both the public health and economic crises that arose from COVID-19. So what I'd like to do here is give you a sense of what the core functions of the three central agencies were during that time. And if there's a bit of time left, offer a bit of a thought on the role of central agencies more generally, and the relationship dynamics between central agencies and line departments. And I'd like to get into something that I think needs a lot more research. Like my initial comments here and my initial writings in the project are just kind of initial thoughts, but I think we need more research on how central agencies are able to provide that central coordinating role during emergencies and at other times. So I think to go back to something that Kathy had mentioned, during the WE controversy and the committee appearances that we saw during that time, we got kind of a rare glimpse into what really happened on the inside during this process of the government trying to manage the response to COVID-19. And we saw pretty extraordinary appearances from the Prime Minister to the clerk to a number of ministers and senior officials, the Kielburgers, you know, we got all different sides to this while the committee met over the summer. And one of the most interesting quotes I thought came from Minister Qualtrough, who is the Minister for Employment, Workforce Development and Disability Inclusion. And she said it was a pandemic and things were crazy and we were going at breakneck speed. And so I thought that was a really interesting comment to reflect on, because I wondered, okay, so, you know, I think regardless of what one thinks of the Prime Minister's ethical record and whether or not the WE contribution agreement was appropriate and all the rest of it, I think that particular case study is going to go down in history as a kind of case study to explore challenges to political management, but also to public administration. And so I think one of the things that we have to look at maybe is it possible that there was too much strain at the time on what we expected from central agencies? Was there an issue with respect to central coordination, and what can we learn from that? And so that's one of the things that I'd like to pick up in research as we move on, and as we get, hopefully, at some point when we can see this crisis in the rearview mirror, there'll be a bit of hindsight that'll be worth mining at that point. So I'll start with the Department of Finance. So their role was obviously pretty front and center. So they, in ordinary time, they are setting economic policy. I mean, the time that we see the finance department is the most is when the finance minister delivers a budget. But we actually haven't gotten a budget from this government, even though they were elected almost exactly a year ago. They made the decision during COVID not to offer a budget because the ability to predict economic trends at that point was so difficult. Although there was some pushback, obviously, from the opposition parties and from previous parliamentary budget officer about whether that was really the right decision or not. But ultimately, even though we didn't get a budget, we did get something that was called a fiscal snapshot in July that gave a kind of overall picture of how the government had responded to COVID, how the response seemed to line up globally, what kind of deficit that leaves us with, how are we going to manage that? And the argument seems to be, as long as we don't have to do this again, we should be able to manage it fiscally largely because of the low cost of borrowing. But if you read through the language of that fiscal snapshot, the tone is very much, we were responding very, very quickly. We were thinking about people's needs. We were trying to meet those needs with programs, and we weren't trying to, we were sort of like get to things now, verify things later, which I think, it came up in one of the questions, could be something that's expected of the public service going forward. But anyway, Department of Finance obviously worked with different, with CRA, with the SDC to move programs out like CERB, like the wage subsidy. And so I think in many ways, the finance department was really taking a lead on some of the things that, some of the actions of the public service that will really go down as making history in their response to COVID-19. Treasury Board had the role of trying to coordinate the movement of the public service to remote work, which was, particularly, this was something that, even though many people have worked in some cases from home, worked remotely before, the idea of all of a sudden having to move the whole public service to remote work, or almost the whole public service to remote work, at the same time as the public service is being expected to deliver new programs with rapid speed. So Treasury Board is doing this, offering guidelines on work-life balance, how to do secure work from home, how to maximize productivity, how to deal with sensitive documents, how to make sure that rules around bilingualism are still protected when people are working from home. So all those kinds of things that honestly I didn't give a whole lot of thought to at the time. Treasury Board was kind of trying to make those things work. And so very much a kind of internal behind the scenes role, but extremely important in trying to move that whole thing forward. And I think it'll be interesting to see what the Treasury Board does going forward, when many are, we're still kind of obviously not out of the woods in this thing, and that we are meeting on this Zoom thing right now rather than downtown. And so how long are we going to be able to do this? And what will we do when there's parts of the public service working at home and parts are back in the office, and how do we maintain that teamwork? And so that's going to be all really interesting material for TBS to continue to take the lead on. Finally, the Privy Council Office. So I think where the major role for PCO was at this point is to provide support to the Prime Minister, to the Deputy Prime Minister, who also has support from PCO, and the Cabinet Committee on COVID-19, where many of the kind of central departments who were feeding into that federal government response to COVID-19, that's where a lot of those ministers were meeting. And so the Privy Council Office's role was really to kind of give a lot of support to that cabinet committee. And so one of the interesting things that seemed to me to come out of that was that we saw this kind of division of labor between the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister. And so just to kind of roll back a little bit, when oh God, I've got like one more minute. When the Deputy Prime Minister was appointed in 20...
If I can interrupt, think of time as just a chimera of bourgeois capitalist existence.
No, I want to be respectful to Andy, and I want to,
There is no hurry.
The appointment of Chrystia Freeland as Deputy Prime Minister in 2019 came after I think, 13, 14 years of having no deputy prime minister. And so it was an interesting kind of point for the prime minister to include this role in his cabinet. And the fact that he appointed Freeland, I think, was no surprise at all, given that I think she was known at that point as his right hand, somebody he trusted very much, and somebody who had come through, obviously, the first mandate as a star. And so here she was in this role. And so during COVID, we saw the prime minister, as Kathy said, like doing these press conferences from his driveway where he was talking about the programs and he was talking about how the government will be here for you. His point was to be very reassuring. And you see Chrystia Freeland and the other ministers meeting with Dr. Tam down at the Press Gallery Theatre, giving, very much the nuts and bolts side of here are what the public health regulations mean. Here's what we're doing in terms of the Canada-US border. Here's what this is like, is very much what I saw to be the kind of the concrete substantive bits. And so what did that say about that kind of division of power between the deputy prime minister and the prime minister? And so it's hard to parse that relationship because it really depends. The relationship is what the prime minister says it is. We've seen deputy prime ministers who had kind of like particular projects that they worked on. Whereas if you look at Chrystia Freeland's mandate letter, there's almost nothing that she doesn't have her hands in, which is not fine. But what does that mean going forward? And what does that mean for how this government is organizing its executive? What does that mean for what the prime minister is doing with cabinet committees? And so I'm going to leave it there just to kind of throw all that at you, and we can mine some of this stuff maybe during the question and answer period. Thanks so much, Toby.
Great, thank you very much. And a reminder that I will ask the questions. So if you have questions, you have multiple ways to send them in. Obviously on the chat function here, or through the other ways I mentioned before, through YouTube or the Slack workspace. And I gather you can do it on Twitter, like so many ways, and then they will be sent to me and I will push them on to you. If you want to hang in for more of a one-on-one discussion, as Jeff mentioned, we will be breaking out into individual workshops at the end of the hour. Okay, so let me introduce Andrew Graham, who's an adjunct professor at Queen's and was also part of and also was the lead in one of the chapters to give us his perspective on the disruption caused during the COVID-19 pandemic that will have an impact on government and governance. Andy? I neither see nor hear you. Is that me?
I can see him.
That's not you, Toby. So go ahead and maybe carry on, or he might be back here now, actually.
Okay, that's
There you
good.
are, Andy.
Okay. I live in the country, and therefore the connection sometimes gets lost. So I'm actually going to report on the work that a team consisting of Eugene Lang from the school and Toby, who needs no introduction, and myself, focusing on the public service and policy impact. And I'm going to focus on the public service tonight because I actually reported out some preliminary findings at the last policy crunch of last year. And so I won't be dwelling on those. So it'll be really on the public service and the policy and implementation challenges this disruption has caused, and some thoughts about convergence with some preliminary ideas that we wanted to put forward. I think you're already seeing a theme here is that huge part of our job was, as we saw it under Kathy's leadership, was not to solve things, but to start to identify them, to start to say, look, this needs more work, more thought in different sort of ways. And so I recognize that we are not even in the middle of this thing, of this grinding crisis, and the middle keeps changing on us. And that very much is going to affect our findings and the way we approach the next phase of what we do, which I can assure you, I don't think we've really talked about, Kathy, but I know there will be a hunger for us to do more. And as such, whatever tentative conclusions we offer here are at best subject to rethinking as the crisis unfolds. But it's clear to all of us, and you've heard it already tonight, that the public service continues to deliver on many fronts in this unfolding crisis. But the fault lines have emerged that may well inform what kind of public service is going to emerge from this crisis and potentially from a rethinking, which is something I want to talk about at the end about public service. As we're seeing in the current entrenchment and focus on the continuing demands on the short term, it's hard to tell what the actual impact is going to be. The first rush of urgency is over, but now what? The second guessing has already started, even as Canada's public services continue to adapt and innovate in the moment. But the moment is not over, and therefore they're going to have to face that adaptation within an adaptation as whatever is emerging in the second wave and response it articulates itself. There have been trip-ups. There's no question there's been trip-ups, and there's been serious errors, and there's been cracks in our delivery capacity. We certainly, and just think about the whole supply chain issue as it evolved. But do they take away from the positive findings? Well, yes, they do in some cases. No, they don't, and maybe they don't. That's a really good academic answer, by the way. The public bureaucracy rose to the crisis during adopting new technologies very, very quickly, accelerating decisions and getting things done. It proved what its capabilities, and that's without doubt in my mind reestablished at a specific level of public services, not at the broad level, do you like government, but rather talk to us about your faith in various delivery parts of the public service, and it probably has hugely been enhanced. Much has been learned about the capacity to adopt facilities, to remote work, to speed up procurement, to take risks to get results, and also address systemic gaps in programs, because that's been going on in throughout this process. And out of all of this crisis brought what we as a group, and of course now been adopted by the working group as a whole to be published shortly, are what we see as three main challenges. And they're very high level challenges, and you can break them down, you can disaggregate them and see different elements. But the first was we saw an emergence of the public service as a better Sherpa to the policy process and not a controller of it. This crisis has demonstrated that the public sector leadership is able to broaden its role to working with many policy and delivery actors like it never had done before. This means a greater porousness in the public service and moving faster and better to get at results. More players from the private sector, and by private sector, I also mean the not-for-profit sector, broadly, and we can talk about that. But also, and this was I found of great interest in, especially in early days, the accelerated engagement of actually the technical expertise that actually was within government in terms of program design, which is atypical often of the separation between policy and operations in government. Their greater engagement led to quicker adaptation of policy initiatives. So they acted as Sherpas rather than gatekeepers. Feasibility and assurance of delivery meant that the policy design had to engage technical and operational players like it never had before. Can we get this done overnight? That was the question. So therefore, you had to have the technical answers quickly. You didn't have the time to sort of play out the implementation game. The operational level of government, often an orphan in the policy making, was front and center. It's clear that policy design skills have to change to turn the old policy and implementation game into an integrated policy delivery model with more players, implementation being paramount, and policy built to actually work. What the we controversy showed us was that this did not give this need to have this integration, this need to move quickly, did not give us the license, however, to abandon due diligence. We just had to be good at it. We just had to be better at it. And for the most part, we were, as a public service, good at that. The we controversy showed the fault lines where it could not, where the boundaries still, how do you say this? The boundaries are still real, but they do not have to be the boundaries that have been created over the last 25, 30 years, which leads to my second topic, which is the breaking of the risk-averse stagnation within the public service. This crisis has shown the public service, backed by political and bureaucratic will, can take risks and produce results quickly. The risk-averse culture that has emerged in the last, I've written down here in my notes 20 years. Having been a public servant for a long time, I'd go back a lot longer than that. Can be overcome in a crisis. Now, but surely this risk-averse culture fails to serve Canadians well. No one wants stupid risks and avoidable mistakes. That's not what we talk about here. But the culture of risk aversion is more insidious than just being careful. Policy is designed to avoid future blame, not necessarily produce results. Safeguards are built onto more safeguards to avoid criticism. It has meant that public servants look to covering their backs rather than serving the public. And it has also led to, perversely, an audit explosion and not a results explosion. And so that the public service need leaders who are risk savvy, not risk averse. There's a fundamental difference there. I don't believe in saying everybody should take wild risks. We don't want stupidity. We don't want, people making bad mistakes, but we want people who have a really smart idea of what risk is all about. So these leaders need to build a culture of results focused on the public they serve. The final broad observation of the public service that we made is designed, we're calling this design for delivery. And the subtitle of this, of course, is way beyond working from home. Okay. Public policy design and delivery has to be faster, more technically competent, and with modern systems. And certainly this emerged as a fault line throughout this, is the adequacy and inadequacy of the modern systems of the systems that were at play in terms of communications, digital, and data. Okay. Effective capacity to respond in new ways of working, be it in an office setting or on a front line, where, by the way, most public servants work. They don't work in offices. They work in the front line serving Canadians. The phenomenon of working from home is just part of a larger issue about how governments should organize their work. And the public services, the services have to be more digital. They have to, as they have often become in this process, and governments have already recognized this, but I think there's a real, we think there's a real need to accelerate it. Data gaps has also emerged as an issue around common data platforms on the public health side, the use of common and shared data across governments, and the availability of information in a speedy way really did emerge in a number of places. So work design has to focus on the work done and who's going to benefit from it. And therefore, taking back to my theme, is this isn't just about people working at home, because you don't do a very good job of guarding the border from home. You got to be there. Okay. And so therefore that means work design has to change quite radically if we're going to deal with the issues that have emerged from this. So we don't know where this is taking us. We're seeing heartening signs of social solidarity that suggest improvements and change. We're seeing also existential attacks on core public institutions, attacks on the basis of the public service itself, its core values, and social disruption of frightening proportions. Now, I'm not just talking about the South. I mean, there's some real issues emerging. Our concern is whether or not this next phase is going to be worse, because the first phase, it was the social solidarity seemed to prevail. For us in Canada, we have reason to hope, but concern that we will waste the chance to dream and get even better in terms of good public service. Dr. Gianna Pomada, who's a professor of the history of medicine at Johns Hopkins University, has described the pandemic as an accelerator of mental renewal. And noting, and one has to read the whole article, noting well that the Renaissance arose out of the Black Plague. And it's a terrible comparison, but at the same time, it's I think a telling thing that we want to think about is what renewal is going to emerge from this. Such renewal of our public services needs a platform to stimulate reflection and build future models. Excuse me. We at Queen's are pursuing our individual elements of our white paper, but I'm going to suggest that the country needs an even larger platform than that even Queen's can produce, as good as that is. We need to partner this out at the very least, and I'm going to suggest something even more ambitious. But that is why I am so encouraged, however, by the work that IOG is doing in starting to look at public service and the new public service beyond COVID, and not just these events, but much more broadly. But I want to push it for a little further in closing, and this is a conclusion of the group. We actually want to be very bold and Canadian in making a broad recommendation, and that's that we should actually have a Royal Commission on the public service. To lead its reframing that our work has pointed to and that others have pointed to. If you take a look at the Canadian Public Administration release today, massive, it's saying the same thing. It's saying the same thing. And I call me traditional, call me old fashioned, call me Canadian, but that is what Royal Commissions are supposed to do, to provide thoughtful, reflective, inclusive, and free of the moment thought about the future. And I would point out that we are the only Westminster country that hasn't done one in the last 20 years on the public service. That being said, I'm going to stop and turn it over to Toby.
Okay, thank you, Andy. I would never call you any of those things. Let me hear you. We're getting some questions coming in. I'd like to get some more, so please use whatever channel you want to get them in. I have one I want to put to Kathy that's come in, which is kind of interesting. There seemed to be absolutely no traction by the opposition in the issue of how to bring back Parliament and all of the above. And in fact, the trust levels for the Prime Minister went through the roof because, and I would argue, and maybe the individual does, because of the fact that he was out there every day at 11 o'clock speaking to Canadians. Does this tell you that the kinds of issues you're raising are just not considered as important by Canadians? Or is this telling you that this was really a function of the time, if you see what I mean, and the crisis?
Thanks, Toby. I think there are two ways to answer that. The way I would begin is by saying that Canadians didn't understand and were so concerned about COVID that they didn't understand the full effects this would have on accountability for government. However, when we saw the questions raised about CERB, and when we saw the WE controversy start to emerge, the committee investigations, then Canadians stopped. And I noticed that I even started to get more questions from Canadians coming in saying, you know, what is Parliament doing? And that's when people really began to question. But also, if you notice the polls, they began to fall quite precipitously for the Prime Minister and for the current government. They regained during prorogation, but if you notice that the support for the Liberals and Conservatives is now neck and neck according to some of the latest polls. So it shows me that there was a delayed effect, which is understandable. People were focused on the disease, what it was doing. They wanted the reassurance. They wanted to hear Justin Trudeau, Premier Ford, premiers from Quebec, Alberta, BC out saying that it's going to be okay. And they wanted some quick answers. They saw the programs rolling out. But as the faults with the programs are revealed, and they're going to be revealed, people are going to be saying, what was our government doing? And what was the opposition doing? Where the blame will settle, that I don't know. So that would be my second part.
Okay. Laurie, questions come in arguing that for many years, let me read it to you, the conventional wisdom was that central agencies, and especially PCO, exercised iron control over the government. Do you assess that control the same? Is it growing? Is it diminishing? And more relevant, perhaps, its effectiveness, growing, diminishing, the effectiveness of these three central agencies?
That's a really good question. Like that has been the conventional wisdom, right? Is that there's definitely not, the relationship between central agencies and line departments has been described by people like Donald Savoy and Peter O'Coin as being particularly tense and fraught. And some of that tension is good, right? Because there's supposed to be a challenge function there. And if they all get along all the time, that's probably an indication that there's something wrong. There's going to be a certain amount of, like, just in the day-to-day handling of a file, the ownership of a file, there's going to be, because PCO is responsible for briefing the Prime Minister on Cabinet, for controlling the flow of paper to Cabinet, for, you know, designing the template from the memoranda to Cabinet, even down to something like that, which is, you know, supposed to be a template. It's still a way of kind of designing what kind of how information is handled, when something is ready to go to Cabinet, you know, what the briefing is going to be going up. Like, there's a lot of opportunities for those central agencies to play that coordinating function in a way that pushes back on what departments are trying to do. Whether or not they're getting more controlling or less is something I'd like to look at more carefully. And I think the interesting thing about that question is that we have a tendency to conflate, and maybe this is right and maybe it's wrong, or maybe sometimes it's right, sometimes it's wrong. We have a tendency to conflate that coordinating function of central agencies with the concentration of power on the political side. And so it seems to me that in this case, like, not necessarily because of COVID, but in the last part of his mandate and going into his second mandate, the Prime Minister changed his tune in how he was approaching Cabinet and how he was approaching kind of the design of the decision-making process. So when he first became Prime Minister, he said, you know, not only did he say he was going to have a gender equal Cabinet, which he did, he chose 30 ministers, whereas comparatively, you know, Harper had like 39 at one point. And Justin Trudeau argued that he was going to have cabinet government. And he talked about a return to cabinet government, which is a whole other story. And he envisioned this scenario where ministers owned their files, took responsibility for their files, and cabinet was a collaborative place. He didn't have anything like his father's priorities and planning committee, which had been replicated in some form by prime ministers after him. The second Prime Minister Trudeau envisioned this big room with everybody talking. And if you compare his approach to that with his father's approach to that, what his father said about cabinet was that cabinet should be this deliberative place, right? Whereas, I mean, the second, like, but it hasn't really happened that way with the second Prime Minister Trudeau. And I think you could see, perhaps because of the way things had happened for him and different events, different scenarios, you could see him moving more toward a streamlined decision-making process in cabinet. He doesn't have anything that's called a priorities and planning committee, and my guess is he'll never have that. But he started to create a cabinet committee structure that is able to streamline decisions. And you can see that, and I would argue that the COVID-19 committee, with all those key ministers at the table, was a way of him kind of creating that rapid fire response during an emergency. And so it's going to be interesting to see whether he continues with that style, you know, as this thing becomes a thing of the past, I hope.
That notion of cabinet government that he described takes you back to Mike Pearson, for heaven's sake, because it was in fact Trudeau, the father, who said, I can't stand all this discussion. We need to become a little more businesslike. I want to pick up, though, on a flip side of something you said about the central agencies. They create a bit of an echo chamber, don't they, if they're kind of like-minded? And it strikes me that the fact that they weren't connecting with departments as much as perhaps they should, according to your thesis, is it means that they're not getting input that they should get. Is that a fair statement? Pause.
I talk forever, Andy. Do you want to answer?
No, please, Laura. I'm really interested in what you have to say.
I don't like. That's something that I'm interested in pulling on the threads on, right? Because there were a few points in those meetings of committee where I kind of wondered, like, what happened? Like, there was a few points with, like, in testimony, when you were comparing the testimony of ministers and the clerk and senior officials, where I wondered, okay, when the Prime Minister said that he pulled the item from cabinet, then where was the follow-up after that? And that was a bit of a distressing thing for me, but I'm not sure. Like, I think we need, you know, this is another academic answer. We need more time to sort this stuff out.
Okay, I have a question from Slack for Andy. How has the pandemic influenced collaboration between departments? So perhaps picking up a little bit on this theme. Any thoughts?
First of all, hi Enid, how are you? Great to see you there. We don't have a lot. We don't have a lot of evidence except around a couple of themes, and I was actually going to, it actually supports and probably add some depth, not depth, sorry, some color to what Laurie was saying. It's really clear that certainly in early days, and I really draw a separation between the now and early days, that departments were drawn in very quickly to negotiate quick response design. And in fact, there were telephone calls made, and the stories are out there, and there were telephone calls made between finance and especially employment, where the announcement was held up until employment said, we can do this. So, I mean, I view that as both an extremely high degree of collaboration, and also a sort of a sign that they can do it differently. Now, how that has sustained itself over time, we don't know at the moment. But the other part is that, in fact, you're hitting upon a theme that, once again, we really think we need to find out more about. And unfortunately, it's not going to be an objective reports and information. And that's that we often talk about this crisis as if all of government were responding. Well, huge parts of government aren't doing anything, okay? Or they're just getting along. I mean, and so parts of government have stood down, and just to get to your point, I mean, I'm trying to get to your point here, but one of the ones that really struck me was that there were key players who should have been playing, who didn't understand they should have been playing until they got knocked in the head. And just go to the border agency and BC in the early days. And in fact, at that point, the border agency's view was, this is a public health problem, it's nothing to do with us. And the Premier of BC is screaming at them saying, stop this. We need border security support as a public health issue. And okay, I'm not going to fault anybody. I'm being very unfair in describing what happened out there, because ultimately border agency stood up and said, yeah, we now understand, we now understand. I mean, they never said that, but the point was that in the early days, the collaboration was not that great for some, was fabulous for others if it was hardwired and if it was public health. If it was not public health, but was still relevant, a lot of that hard wiring had to be put in place very quickly.
Yeah.
So, sorry,
just going to say, certainly some of the executives I talked to, there was also a lot of collaboration between departments on sort of the internal machinery issues, as opposed to the as well, by the way, and is I think worth noting perhaps.
Yeah.
I have a question that's come in on the chat for all of you, and let me just, I might as well just go through it. It's saying, if innovative behavior in the public service is generally more successful when it gets approval from top executives and the political sphere, would this not generate an increasing appetite on the political side for more emergency-like situations, so that change can be driven and pushed? So, Kathy, I'll let you start with that one.
Yeah, you do it.
I like that question. It has a nice twist to it there.
Yeah.
I think we've already seen that in part. And certainly with the prorogation of Parliament, the Prime Minister went back into a mode where he could do briefings without opposition. And that's something that we could see settling into the public sector more so. But, and this is one way in which, and I guess this ties back to my first answer, this is one way in which Parliament is going to be quite relevant, because we saw people being called before Parliament. The government did let people from the public sector speak to a certain extent. And I think Parliament is going to be pushing for more answers and for more scrutiny of government. We're also seeing a certain amount of transparency that the public has been used to. And so the public is going to be asking tough questions. So if government starts to push the emergency dialogue too far, people are already getting tired of it.
Yeah.
And I think it's going to wear thin, and to pull it back and to keep coming back with it after that is going to be very difficult, particularly as Parliament starts to push for more transparency on those decisions.
Okay, Andy, and then Laurie. Andy, you want to turn on your mic?
Was it not Raul Emanuel who said, "Don't waste a good crisis"? I actually do believe that at the policy level, the government had a perception that they could move in a certain direction, and in terms of income support, etc. And the wind up to the speech from the throne, which turned out to be a wind down, of course, but the wind up was around, a huge expectation that this crisis was going to be used as an opportunity to move forward with a new agenda, and they abandoned that for whatever reason. But to go to the public service side, in terms of a crisis, I must say I didn't see a lot of evidence. I mean, I certainly saw. The question that I have is all the workarounds, all of the quick ways of doing things, all of the new things like CRA walking in and taking over particular programs. Was that temporary, or is that just going back? And I'm not getting any signals, I'll be honest with you. I'm not confident that this has taught the public service to move forward. I actually think it needs an external stimulus to make that happen.
Laurie, any thoughts?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I mean, I think that the weird thing about this crisis is that it's designed not to be terrible, not that it was designed, but it's not short term, but it can't go on forever either. Like, I used to study emergency management, and the practitioners in emergency management, everyone I talked to in different jurisdictions in the country would say, it doesn't matter what the emergency is, we handle it the same way. So whether it's a flood or a terrorist attack, like basically it's the same order of operations. We call the same people in the same order. It's this kind of, there is a kind of protocol to it that applies. And the worst thing that can happen is when a politician shows up, because the politician wants to be in the camera and show the voter that they're responsible and they care and stuff. And they're like, this is the last thing we need. We just leave it to us to get this resolved. And so COVID is such a kind of challenge to that set of assumptions and that way of doing business, because the politicians are front and center here. And this is something that has to be managed over time. And there is no protocol for this. And the public service needs, does have to make at least medium-term changes to how things are done, if not short-term changes, or if not long-term changes. And so I think, it is also going to depend on what happens going forward. We are in a minority government situation, which is also by definition temporary. And I think we can see between what we saw in the speech from the throne and Erin O'Toole's response to it, and also make perhaps a bit of a adrenaline shock into the Green Party this weekend, that I think we are going to see some actually really interesting ideas about where people want to go policy-wise. And I think we're on the cusp of perhaps in some ways, a very negative campaign, because it will come down to trust versus mistrust, but also like hopefully a contrasting set of policy ideas about what we're going to do and what the role of the state is, which is going to cover both the public service and the political side.
So look, I am conscious of time, and we have time maybe just for one quick question to you all before we break into the groups. And I want to frame it this way, if I could. The conversation, although it's come and gone on this, but really is comparing a normal state with the crisis, if you like. And of course, to your point that Laurie's just made, it looks like this crisis is going to be ongoing, and returning to normal, if such a thing occurs, is going to be delayed. So my question for each of you is, and I'll start this time with Laurie, is What's your biggest concern in this world of disruption and governance as we hunker down for an extended crisis before we get back to normal?
Honestly, this is something I don't know anything about. I have no expertise in this whatsoever. But my biggest concern is for people's mental health, because I think the logistics and the like, when we locked down in March, it was so different because I didn't see that coming at all. I was so like, it was sort of overnight when like, or at least over maybe the course of a week where everything shut down and all of a sudden everyone was in the same situation. But we were going into spring, and in a couple of months, things did open up a little bit and patios opened and you could walk around and you could have little gatherings. And now in my part of the world, in the Halifax part of the world, you know, we're in a bubble, or I'm not there yet, but people there are in a bubble, and things are there's a sense that things are safe there. But if we're heading into another lockdown, if that's going to happen, and it's in the winter, and people are going to miss holidays, and there's another, you know, there's more trauma to the economic situation, and businesses that are hanging on now might not be able to make another round of this. So, and I worry about that reality being such a weight on people. Okay,
and quickly, Andy, in terms of, you were talking about the public service and so on, what's your biggest fear that as we go through this protracted period?
Like Laurie, I've been studying and actually managing crises for a long time, and a crisis modality. And I'm just going to riff off what Laurie said, because I think she's hit to the heart of the matter. A crisis modality is not sustainable in terms of sustaining mental health, but also sustaining services, sustaining a sense of moving forward, because that's really where I think we've lost. And my biggest concern is that we still remain at a kind of a hiatus point with respect to public services, where they're not being provided because we're in a crisis. So I think that's the immediate concern. My second concern is there's an opportunity here. Why? How can we not? I can't waste this amazing opportunity, because we're not going to be emerging from it as if everything now it's all over, it's all fixed. Things are going to change. So let's
last word to you, Kathy. Kathy, last word to you.
Yep. My biggest concern is social cohesion, and that goes to the mental health issue. It also goes to children. And what I'm hearing from different people about kids not trusting adults now, not trusting others, not trusting strangers, but also you see a breakdown in society right now. People are not as unified as they were at the beginning. And ultimately, when you start to see people thinking about programs in terms of the benefits that come to them, who's getting what, and what am I not getting compared to my neighbor, that has an impact on political legitimacy and the quality of democracy. So that's where my concerns go.
So thank you very much to all three of you. And just before we go into the breakout groups, there have been some questions that I could not get in. And so I would encourage the questioners to join the breakout group, put them to the individuals directly. Before we get the instructions for that, could I hand it over to Rhonda for 1 minute?